In part 1 and 2 of this 3-part studio lecture, we looked firstly at the notions of mapping, making sense of the line as border, the line as mapping device, creating worlds through drawing, through experimenting with different materials, and in doing that, started to think about how do we illustrate and activate the unknown, the undefined. How do we create a notion of world and sense-making through that which we do when we trust the process, when we engage in each other's narratives, when we start looking at the collaborative outcome that comes from dialogue and exchange. And so I showed various examples and experiments, as well as doing some things live in the studio. So stepping into part 3, we're now going to look at the idea of embodying these things. How do we take it out of the map, out of the format, and how do we create something that looks at probing and agitating some of the tensions that we find ourselves in? You know, what happens between different notions and ideas that we want to explore, and where do we sit in placing our bodies into that so that we can feel and also relay that which we want to talk about to the audience. I want to start by exploring the notion of embodiment through the examples of the activities I did in Ústí at Labem with other artists and students, some of them which I showed you in the previous talks and parts, and bringing back some of the materials that we were exploring at the time. So for example, we were in the woods exploring, evoking or presenting a feeling through a new material, and taking that same material, we then encased ourselves, making ourselves one with that material, thinking about what happens when we take that which we saw in the woods and cover ourselves and explore. And explore what it means to envelop oneself and disappear into a completely different state of being, into something that is looking inwards, that reflects on being protected, that reflects on being in a space. So the video clips I'll show you now are the participants' responses to taking that medium from the woods and reflecting on that for themselves. So while this act afforded us a certain amount of meditation and reflection, and also created some really interesting new shapes and forms on the screen that you could see. The landscape, the creatures, the experiments. That very personal process is very important, and I urge you to find ways of getting into that zone, getting into that space. Turn off your lights, stand staring into a corner for 10 minutes, walk into a place that you don't know, or that you're curious about, a tunnel or a place that feels enclosed, or go out into a place where there's an open landscape and a beautiful just horizon line, and look into the sky and really lose yourself in what's around you in order to reflect back on what's inside you. This is just a very small act to try and kind of loosen up the obsession that we've had so far with mark making and trying to make marks on the wall and on the canvas or on the wall, and try to build something. That space of meditation and reflection is just about acknowledging your environment and your context, and kind of getting to feel it, smell it, touch it, and very often by enclosing oneself in it and covering oneself in some form, one helps just recenter that. And then by looking out and opening it up, it's about an acknowledgement of what's around. And that acknowledgement of what's around in the space that we're in is a really important one. The walls, the ceiling, the floor are all surfaces to play with. And so I'm going to show you another example now of a really exciting moment where we did this collectively as a group. What you will hear is the sound of us beating the wall, but there were also moments of screaming and shouting and calling something into reality, evoking something. It was an unrehearsed and experimental way of trying to create a collective space of co-production where our individual meditations become a collective meditation and a calling into the space for something to develop. What's very exciting for me in watching this again and reflecting on it is how the live drawing tool that you see that's projected onto us, onto our bodies, really helped in acknowledging the marks that were being made, even on that big canvas, which is the same canvas that's behind me, that enveloped us eventually, and that we went into this space of hiding, that we went into this space of covering ourselves once again, and then the kind of scene that evolved from it, which is again a landscape scene with a narrative that starts to evolve, where someone is doing something, someone else is doing something else, and these worlds come together into a completely new kind of narrative. And so this journey was possible because we all felt our bodies present in the space, and we used the materials and the tools in the space to develop. And so this act of actually sharing a space with someone else is a really important moment when you reflect on not a performance, but a process of performing. So again, I ask you to invite someone into your studio, this time not to draw collectively or explore a medium collectively, but actually just to share what you did before by being in a space with someone else. So what happens when two bodies exist in a space and move around each other and find a common thing, or make a sound together, or project some ideas together, and in that allow a new journey to happen. So the next example shows you how two of the participants, myself and Michal, responded to someone else's image and actually tried to make sense of something that was then imposed on us. Again, we were embodied and in an environment, which means that we actually had to react somehow to that which is projected on us and around us, and using the tools to our disposal to make sense of it. And now a moment where an image is projected and we are all asked to step into the scene one by one, reflect on what that means and what we're doing by doing something, and then repeating that collectively, where we all step into the space at the same time on this repetitive journey. So when looking at these repetitive actions that everyone's doing, of that the almost like an orchestra coming together with all these sounds that are repeated to create a rhythm and a journey and a harmony, here it's about the dysfunctional meeting of different elements that bump into each other, that collide, that create something new in that collision. But what's very interesting, as a little side note, is that the image that's projected is of the coal mines in and around Ústí and Labem that we directly or indirectly might be responding to. It's a very important topic in the area, and everyone's informed about what these coal mines are, where they come from, why they exist, and the complexities around them. And somehow, by putting such a contentious subject into the projection, immediately creates connotations. Whether each participant thought about that and responded to that, I don't know. But watching it again now, I can see all these actions starting to be about a kind of a sense-making of that which is represented in the image. So in the same way, I hope to be making a bit more sense of that which has started to evolve behind me by immersing myself into this and thinking about in the studio what I can do with that. Now, I've shown you very active engagements and processes, but what is really magical is when you actually then find a place to go back into that space of meditation. So here is a little clip from a moment where we're looking back into a landscape after an active engagement and activity in the projection as different bodies, and we all realize that we need to escape. And what I did as a way of playing with that is to introduce sound into the mix. So the act of embodying is very much about being in a space, but it's also using your different senses to make sense of that space. Here now, the introduction of sound starts to create a very different journey. Again, Molisile Bongwana, whose sound piece you would have heard in a previous work that I showed you in part 2, starts to set a mood. And suddenly, once the music was there and we found a place of calm, something incredible happened. We connected on an emotional level, which like we hadn't done before in that space. Before in that space, we were caught in tension, we were caught in exploring, and we were caught in mark making and mapping, and then suddenly we stepped into a completely new space. We shared an emotion. We could feel each other's presence in the space, and at the same time, the magical part of it was that we were looking into a landscape which was projected, but really embodied a space that we had explored emotionally. It's very difficult to make sense of it now by just looking at this footage again, but I can definitely feel that moment. And I think that's what's so important about the embodiment, is feeling that which you want to relay somehow for yourself in order to then try and make the work speak in some way to others. So the embodied experience is obviously a solo practice sometimes, but once you come in tune with those around you and you're actually able to work together on something, a completely new dialogue happens. And this moment was a really special one, an important one in that. And it taught me that it's not always about trying to hold on to that mark on the canvas or trying to try and capture something that on camera or something, but it's just about allowing the conditions of the space and the people around you and their emotional state to inform you more than you imposing yours on them. I'm going to show you a few examples now of other works that I've done that relate to this idea of putting yourself into a space to try and make sense of something. I now want to look back at a project that was very meaningful to me, that actually was a pivotal moment of acknowledging my embodied experience in my own process of making. In 2017, I invited Molisile Bongwana, whose music you've heard in different parts of this lecture series, to join me in a studio dialogue. While he as a performer stepped into the space in the studio performance, I tried to capture his movements first through drawing, and then very quickly realized that trying to capture his shadows and movements and sounds through mark making wasn't enough for me to try and express the need to interact with him. And what you're seeing is a very complex relationship that we're forming between two performers that acknowledge each other's vulnerability and difference, and yet at the same time try to reach through this membrane to work into each other's world. This was unrehearsed and experimental, and in that created a really, really important moment for me of acknowledging that which I've been talking about, the embodiment of the experience. This moment informed many works to follow. It has become the go-to place for me when I'm trying to make sense of my own current state of performing or participating in the making process. As I said before, I don't consider myself a performer, nor do I want to present myself as such, but I do feel there is value in documenting and capturing and understanding and presenting one's making process, especially in this very strange space of vulnerability, where in this case, two performers have a vulnerable dialogue about each other's complexities and try to listen and push between their two worlds. It's symbolically a really important thing to consider that when you, as an artist, are presented with the opportunity to hold another artist's vulnerability and guide them through a process, that your empathy and relationship in that moment opens up completely new understanding of your own situation. Well, Lucilia and myself have subsequently engaged in many more dialogues, but this was the first encounter that was so meaningful for both of us. From the previous parts of this lecture program, you will have remembered a journey that we went through making a map out of pieces of wood, and the video I showed you of the belonging to the museum class of the Repatriates project. Here is a clip of where that discourse went to when we started to allow ourselves to be immersed in a projection and react creatively and playfully to what was happening, to the images that we were showing over and above the city that we created. After a very interesting reflection on this experience with the participants, where many of their fears, questions, unknown spaces were revealed in conversation about what they'd experienced, I had the chance to start cleaning up my studio again, and I really enjoyed looking at what had been created and the traces that were left behind from a process. And as I came closer and I looked more closely at what had been left behind from the making, the collective making of all of this, I started to recognize that the embodiment was still there in the form of a small avatar, sitting inside the leftovers and the traces of this process. A tiny little shadow created inside a world that I had not been aware of the whole time. And for me, there's something quite poetic about not only leaving traces of the marks that we've made, but actually embodying oneself through a little shadow that sits in a world after one has immersed oneself in that making process. Discovering this installation that presented the set of embodied experiences reminded me very strongly of a work that I made years ago with two immigrant workers. It was a moment where I explored these Zimbabwean migrants that were living in Johannesburg, who came to find wealth and gold, so to speak, in this mining town, which obviously no longer was mining gold, but it just became symbolic for the search for wealth and money. A lot of these migrant workers were working and still are inside kind of construction and the regeneration of the city, etc. And while working in these construction sites, a lot of them lived in the construction site overnight because it was cheaper to stay there than to migrate back to a home. And in living in that space and being in that space, they started to create these worlds. And by placing these people into this environment and asking them to explore the environment, I started to realize the value of a kind of process of self-discovery within an environment that one is familiar with and yet is alien and foreign to oneself. So the search for something became almost otherworldly. It almost became like being on another planet. And when I looked at the installation now, again from the studio in Vienna, it took me right back to that early work, sitting in the heart of Johannesburg in a construction site with two migrant workers flowing through a space that they were currently transforming in spacesuits and lights, and looking for their gold and their future and their opportunity. And it was through this process of exploration that a new narrative was born. Not only a narrative for a story that I'm presenting in the video, but a narrative for a reflection on themselves within the city of Johannesburg and their dislocation from a world that they know to this unknown territory that they were searching in. And I find myself compelled to think about the role of the artist in that space, and how we are also searching for things, and we use the tools available to us, and we immerse ourselves into something, and in this, new narratives are born. Many of my works are about trying to make sense of the notion of crisis that we're in, and trying to tap into something that we don't quite understand about that crisis. You know, how do I deal with it? What do I do with it? How do I take actions against it or for it? And what do I do as an artist to try and relay that message? So it's tapping into that which we, I guess, are searching for, again, the unknown, and seeing whether my act as an artist can change any of that. And very often that act seems completely futile, pathetic almost. You know, it's like this little drop in the ocean. That, is it going to make a difference? Am I as an artist really going to have an impact on something? So there are moments where I as an artist try to do something, and I realize the very act of doing it is counterintuitive to what we're supposed to be doing, is that undoing a lot of the things that are around us. A work that I think presents this very well is a work called Against the Watershed. It was in 2018 that I was invited to be part of a conference called Watershed around the water crisis that we're facing. And it was hosted at a university that lies on a watershed in Johannesburg. That is a point from which water flows in either direction to the oceans and is a natural kind of departure point for water. I decided, instead of being in the cocktail party sipping wine and talking about what we want to change, that I would try to look at the crisis I was dealing with in making sense of this relationship to water and try and push water against its natural flow. Filling a ball with my weight in water, I was trying to push the ball against its natural flow up the hill. It started as a very ambitious act and very soon proved to be extremely difficult and almost impossible. It was that Sisyphusian, futile act that really, for me, represents that which we go through when we're trying to deal with moments in crises. When we look at the global conditions and we say, well, what am I doing to make that difference? Am I, like Sisyphus, pushing a rock up the hill, knowing that it's going to come back down again, understanding that it is almost a pathetic attempt to change something? So in this case, while I was pushing this ball up the hill, Krista Doherty, a fellow artist, was filming me and live streaming my actions into the cocktail party of the event, trying to kind of witness my act of futility. And that being witnessed and being seen, and yet doing this for myself, was also a very interesting conflict in my mind around why we do these acts in the first place. Are we doing them to be seen? Are we doing them because we truly are trying to explore something? And am I, as an artist, really pushing myself to go beyond, to try and make that change? And even though, if I really am trying to make that change, I know that it's almost a futile act, as I mentioned before, I need to do it. I need to start somewhere. And by starting somewhere, I'm starting to make sense of what my role as an artist is within that context and within that crisis. And so again, the bodily presence of doing something that is hard work, that I can feel has an impact on who I am, and then at the end led me to a complete journey of devastation on the way back down the hill, following the trail of water of the leak in the ball that was running, as it naturally should, back down the watershed. I felt completely defeated and yet inspired to take this the next step. Looking at examples of embodying the map and playing with the map in a particular way as an extension of what we explored in the last two parts of this program, I want to draw your attention back to a particular moment where I was searching the line in the space between North and South Korea in the demilitarized zone in a short video clip that I showed you. Here in this next example, I'm showing you my response to that study, my reflections on that study during a studio experience in a gallery in Helsinki. Here I extend the idea of a line across the floor, up the wall, across the screen, on different surfaces. I play with references from the film. I bring in tools to measure, to orientate, and I desperately try to find a way to express my frustration at not being able to get beyond the line or into the line. And it's interesting watching this afterwards and realizing that in my improvised response to a gut feeling and need to express myself, that there's a really awkward, vulnerable relationship between me and my medium and the audience and the content that's being shown. And while I seem to be in a kind of state of searching for something, at that point I was completely drawn into a different form of expression. It's very difficult to explain, but it's the kind of trance-like state one goes into when one is so immersed in one's process. Looking back at this work now, with a lot of work I've done around lines and borders many years later, I recognize
in my own actions some of the marks that I'm making now and the references I'm making now in current work. So there are interesting insights into that trance-like space that I want to go back into when I'm actually in the mode of making. And that is embodying and immersing oneself into the topic, the feeling, the crisis, the question that one has.
So coming back to the idea of mapping and map making, in whichever form it took and it takes, with all of these strange experiments that we've done over the last few sessions, I want to reflect a little bit on how these maps become physical experiences too. So how do we place ourselves into these maps? How do we start looking at them in a completely different way? How do they become tools for imposing our bodies into them? And so the examples I'm going to show you illustrate some ways that maps have become devices for connecting to people, how maps have become tools for creating embodied experiences by becoming guides for people, and how they've become kind of tools for imposing them onto our lives. What I mean with that is, I can read a lot into this purely by projection. You can read the same. But what I really am excited about is once I look into these spaces and I think about what it means to step into it, to be in it. Does the map itself become a device for allowing a new kind of engagement? So other than reading it literally and trying to follow a line, how does the map create an embodied experience?
I want to share an early project from 2006 where the map led to a meaningful interaction and engagement process. In 2006, in Johannesburg, Stephen Hobbs, my collaborator, and I were destined to do a project in Dakar, in Senegal. Both of us had not been there, but we remembered a moment in Johannesburg where a foreign Senegalese man had told us that it was dangerous to be photographing our own city. So being a tourist in our own city was a really interesting and complex reality of a changing urban environment of Johannesburg. So when invited to do a project in Dakar, we decided, let's interview as many Senegalese immigrants in Johannesburg that we could find and ask them to draw us maps of Dakar. These maps, very abstract, drawn from people out of memory from about 10 years ago, were our only source of orientation when we ended up landing in Dakar shortly afterwards. So we navigated the city based on these abstract drawings and got horribly lost. The intention was to not ask for any other type of maps, not to engage Google or any other sources, but rather explore a city through walking and looking at drawings. So these maps became real guides for us to not only try and find the routes we were told to go along and meet new people that we were told we would come across, but also to explore the city in a completely new way. The magic of the project, post exhibiting and showing and redrawing maps in Dakar, was to come back to Johannesburg. And in a nightclub, we projected up the image of these journeys that we took based on the drawings and presented these images back to the Senegalese immigrants, many of whom were very touched by this experience, and their skepticism of who we were taking the maps on a walk was kind of lifted, and they became a really close-knit, responsive community to this question of creating neighborliness in a very xenophobic and complex city of Johannesburg. So the map itself became a device for navigation, but then became a device for reconnecting in a new city, in a foreign place. And so the map as a tool and map as a guide to create these embodied experiences were very important. We then had the chance to exhibit our experiences in a gallery or in a museum in Johannesburg, and on doing so, our main objective was to once again draw a map to navigate back into a place where we got the first maps. So basically turning the notion of experience back into the artwork and not just trying to showcase something that we had experienced. And so for me, there's a really interesting game that's happening here where the drawing of a map is the tool for a socially engaged and embodied experience. At the end, we can continue to draw maps, like you see the final one, but it is in the act of interacting with what is within the map and the context that that map represents and the people that you encounter, etc., that draws you back to the lived experience. And for me, ultimately, my act as an artist is engaging with that space of the lived experience and making sense of it at every point of the way. And a map and a drawing and its traces become a really interesting record and provocation for the next step.
So as you can see by that process I just went through, that once one starts to think about the visceral nature of the tactile nature of the map, and that in each mark there is actually a dedicated decision and trust and process that's gone into it. And one tries to relay that through the body, or try to capture that through the body. Really strange things happen. And it's about allowing oneself to give over to that. What I just showed you was not planned. It was merely an act of responding to some of the thoughts, ideas, angers, frustrations, happiness, wanting to construct that I had in me in all this time of working on the surface over months. And to have the chance to respond to that, interact with it, is quite important. So in the previous part, I told you to take a map and tear it up and put it back together and play with it and explore redesigning it and reshifting it. In a similar way, I would urge you to try and use your body to interact with something in a particular way, allowing yourself to follow a journey and a thought and allowing your body to play with that. You will notice unplanned some of the elements that happened while interacting with the work earlier. I built a little structure, I threw things at it, I destroyed it, I reconstructed. I realize now when I think about it, I did a lot of things that come back to my original curiosity and questions around borders and territories and ownership. And I guess I imposed a lot of those concepts that I've been thinking about onto this map and onto this work at the end now through this interaction. And I think it's about taking that which we haven't been able to speak about, which we haven't been able to express in other ways, and seeing what happens if we allow ourselves to physically respond in some way to the medium and to that which we've done in the artwork. So again, I need to mention, this is a studio. This is a studio process. It's not meant to be a performance. It's not meant to be something that necessarily, other than in this video, is shown. It's merely something that I'm trying to make sense of. But sometimes it's worth showing the process in order to connect with others, or in order to present an argument, or to allow insight into one's thoughts with an audience that you want to present your journey to. We've done this in several cases, and one of them is also in Ústí at Labem, with a presentation of the projects and processes that we've been through as a projection on a building. And what one needs to then acknowledge and make very clear is that it's not a final work. It's a step in the process of making something more. So I would say, even in that sense, this video and this journey that we've been on together so far is not over. I'd like to say thank you for being part of this 3-part studio lecture and allowing me to make a new body of work and think differently about the process that I'm going through by presenting it to you.